My name is Lena Moore. I'm 31, and I'm from Flagstaff, Arizona, a small city with wide skies and narrow minds. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone knew your name, your parents' jobs, and exactly what made you different. In my case, it was my skin. I have vitiligo. It started as a pale spot on my neck when I was 10, and by the time I was 17, it had spread across my collarbones, my arms, part of my face. No one ever said anything cruel outright. Not the teachers, not the neighbors, but the looks were enough. In a place like Flagstaff, differences weren't discussed, only silently categorized. I spent most of my 20s trying to outrun those stares. I became an expert in makeup, learned to blend my skin into what people called normal. I layered, on foundation so thick I couldn't recognize myself in the mirror, only the version of me that wouldn't make strangers uncomfortable. It worked, most days. In Phoenix, where I moved for college, no one knew the girl I used to be. I kept my shoulders covered, avoided bright lighting, dated casually but never seriously. I didn't think anyone would really look at me and see something worth choosing. Then came Michael. He was the first person who didn't flinch when I forgot to put on makeup one morning after a night at his place. The first person who didn't ask questions, didn't pretend not to notice the patchwork on my skin. He just looked at me and kept talking, like it meant nothing. That silence, his silence, was the loudest kind of kindness I'd ever experienced. We met at a nonprofit gala in Tucson. He was a guest speaker. I was photographing the event for work. He noticed my camera first, then me. We spoke the entire evening like we were picking up a conversation we'd never started. 1 year later, he proposed. I'd never believed in weddings. Not really. Growing up, I used to think marriage was just a nice way to tell a girl her life was over. But with Michael, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like something beginning. He made space for me, made me feel like I didn't have to perform, didn't have to fix or flatten or hide. His mother never liked me. Not once. The first time we met, she greeted me with a look that slid over my body like a microscope, taking inventory of everything she could use against me. I remember how her eyes paused on my neck. It was summer. I was wearing a low-cut dress, and even with makeup, the lighter patches on my skin peeked through. Her smile never touched her eyes. That was the start. For months, she tried to derail everything. She forgot to include me in family gatherings, told Michael she was just worried I'd have a hard time fitting in, sent him links to articles about genetic skin conditions. She never said the word vitiligo. She didn't have to. I told Michael I was fine, that it didn't matter, but it did. It always did. Still, the wedding moved forward. A restored vineyard outside Sedona, simple and quiet, with the desert light rolling over the hills in gold. I'd chosen a dress that showed my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I'd spent the morning in a calm sort of daze, letting the makeup artist work, letting my hair be styled, smiling at the nervous bridesmaids fluttering around me. I felt ready. Not excited, not glowing, but solid, grounded. I wasn't the girl who used to avoid mirrors anymore. When I stepped out onto the aisle, the hush fell like a blanket. I saw Michael's face first, steady and wide-eyed. I saw his father, the pastor, the rows of guests. Then I saw her. She was already standing. She didn't wait for me to reach the altar. She didn't whisper, didn't lean in, didn't even try to lower her voice. It was loud, so loud it cracked through the soft hum of the music like a hammer on glass. She said I would poison their bloodline. She said my children would be monsters, that Michael was making a mistake he could never undo. No one moved. Not Michael. Not his father. Not the officiant. Everyone just froze, caught in the violence of her words. I felt my breath catch in my chest, not because I was surprised. She'd hated me from the beginning. but because I hadn't expected her to break the one sacred thing left. She didn't just insult me. She cursed our future. Out. Loud. In front of everyone I knew. In front of people from work. Friends I'd had since college. Distant cousins who flew in from across the country. And I stood there, under the weight of it all, in a dress I had picked to celebrate everything I had learned to accept about myself. My arms bare. My patches visible. My face calm, even though my spine felt like it would snap under the pressure. My mother started to rise, but I touched her wrist to stop her. Not now. Not yet. I looked back at Michael. I needed to see his face. I needed to know, right then, if I was standing next to a man or a boy still tied to his mother's fear. He didn't say anything, and somehow that silence was even louder than hers. It's strange how quickly a room full of people can forget they have voices. For a second, I wondered if I had gone deaf. The air was too still, too quiet, like the seconds after a car crash when the shock hasn't worn off and sound hasn't found its way back. I was still standing at the altar, frozen, my bouquet trembling in my hands, the lace of my dress clinging to the back of my legs with sweat. Her words were still echoing in my head, bouncing off the high beams and rafters of that pretty little vineyard chapel like an accusation carved into stone. I looked at Michael again. He hadn't moved, not a step forward, not a hand stretched toward me, not even a blink. His face was blank, unreadable, like someone watching a stranger fall from a ledge and waiting to see if they'd hit the ground or learn to fly. It didn't feel like betrayal, not yet, but it felt close. Like the air between us had changed, like we weren't on the same side anymore. People started shifting in their seats. Quiet, fidgety movements, the kind that screamed discomfort. Someone coughed. A woman in the third row looked down at her phone, pretending not to hear. My aunt pressed her lips into a hard line, her knuckles white around her clutch. My best friend Rachel stood from the bridesmaids' row, 1 foot forward, as if ready to storm down the aisle. But she didn't. No one did. His mother was still standing too. Her face hadn't changed since she spoke. There was no shame there, no apology, just a cold satisfaction, like she'd done exactly what she came here to do. And now she was waiting for me to crumble. And maybe I would have. Maybe if this had happened 2 years ago, hell, even 6 months ago, I would have turned around, walked out the doors, and disappeared. But I didn't move either. I just kept staring at Michael, begging him silently to break the spell. Say something. Anything. Take my hand. Tell her to leave. Tell them this isn't who we are. But nothing came. He didn't even look at me. Not really. His eyes hovered near mine but never touched them, like he couldn't face what was standing in front of him, like he wanted to be anywhere else. And still, no one spoke. In the silence, I felt my mind spiral into the empty spaces between the pews. I saw my 12-year-old self in a school bathroom, scrubbing at the white patches on my arms with rough paper towels until they turned red. I saw my first job interview, where the manager stared too long at my neck before saying I wasn't quite the image they were going for. I saw my first boyfriend's mother, whispering something about skin conditions to him when she thought I couldn't hear. I saw the nights I cried into my pillow wondering if I would ever stop being something people had to explain away. And now here I was. In a white dress I paid for myself, in front of everyone I loved, in front of a man who once said he would fight the world for me, and he couldn't even fight her. She sat down slowly, like a queen returning to her throne after issuing a decree, her face calm, like she hadn't just torn through me with a butcher's blade. I wondered if she thought this would be enough to make me walk away. Maybe she thought I was still the girl who needed approval, the one who hid her skin under long sleeves and avoided mirrors with overhead lights. Maybe she thought shame still had a hold on me. But I didn't walk away. I couldn't. Something inside me had locked in place, and it wasn't fear. It was clarity. The officiant, an old friend of Michael's family, cleared his throat nervously. He looked from me to Michael, then to his mother, his eyes wide and uncertain. He didn't speak either. His silence joined the others, a chorus of passive consent. The guests kept looking at each other, unsure of what the right response was. No one wanted to be the first to make a scene. No one wanted to challenge her. Knew then that this wasn't just about me. It never had been. This was about power, control, and blood. I thought about the way she'd always emphasized family, heritage, legacy, what we pass on. I used to think it was just pride, some generational snobbery from a woman raised in private schools and charity luncheons. But now it felt deeper, more personal. Her words weren't just cruelty, they were strategy. She wanted me gone before I became permanent, before I left a mark. The idea of me, of someone like me, becoming part of their bloodline, disgusted her. It didn't matter who I was, what I had done, how much Michael loved me. To her, I was a flaw, a genetic stain she couldn't scrub out. And the worst part? She wasn't alone in thinking it. I saw it in the faces around me. The discomfort, the avoidance, the way no one corrected her. No one stood up, not even him. That realization was a slow, bitter burn under my skin. It settled in my bones like cold smoke, thick and lingering. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, locked in the moment, my breath shallow and my heart beat loud in my ears. Michael finally turned to me then. His mouth opened slightly, like he was about to speak. But he hesitated. He looked at his mother again before his gaze returned to mine. And that was it. The hesitation was all I needed, because hesitation is a choice. He didn't choose me. Not fully, not loudly, not when it mattered most. And in that moment, with 140 people waiting to see what I would do, I realized something I should have known all along. Love means nothing if it needs permission to exist. I didn't move when the ceremony finally disintegrated into an awkward murmur of shuffled feet and confused glances. Someone turned off the music, though I don't remember who. The officiant stepped back without saying a word. Michael's best man leaned in to whisper something, but he stopped himself. I think he knew it wouldn't matter. What could anyone say? What could anyone possibly offer me in that moment that wouldn't taste like pity? I was still standing in front of an altar, in a white dress that suddenly felt like a costume. Something borrowed from a life that never really fit me. I don't remember walking out. I just remember the click of my heels on the stone path as I made my way to the back of the venue, where the bridal suite sat in quiet, floral-decorated judgment. I closed the door behind me and locked it, shutting out the rising storm of whispers and the thick, suffocating quiet of people trying not to stare. Inside, the room was too bright. The mirrors, 3 of them, angled to reflect every inch of my body, greeted me like old enemies. I stood in front of them, still in my dress, still clutching the bouquet I hadn't let go of, and for a long time, I didn't move. It was cruel, the way they surrounded me. Those mirrors, they didn't lie. They didn't soften. They just reflected everything exactly as it was. My hair, once perfectly curled, had started to wilt at the edges. My makeup was still intact, a mask of effort and precision. My eyes, though, my eyes had changed. They didn't look hurt. They looked empty. The dress was beautiful. Ivory silk with lace sleeves and an open back, chosen because for once I didn't want to hide. For once I had decided to stop painting over myself, to let the world see the truth of me. The sleeves were sheer, just enough to reveal the pale, uneven skin underneath. The patches had spread over the years, my elbows, my shoulders, a part of my jaw. It wasn't symmetrical or subtle. It was the kind of skin that made people uncomfortable, that drew questions, assumptions, stares. But I had fallen in love with it, slowly, over time. I had fought for that love, even when it felt like war. I looked at myself. I thought of every fitting room I'd ever stood in growing up. Every dressing room at every department store where I had tried on prom dresses and sweaters, swimsuits and school uniforms, only to turn away from my reflection before the lights could catch what I didn't want them to see. I thought of my mother standing beside me, her voice careful and too gentle, asking if I wanted something a little more covered up. I thought of the summer I was 15, when I wore long sleeves to the beach, because I didn't want to explain to strangers that I wasn't sick, that I wasn't contagious, that I was just different. I remembered crying in a Target fitting room. Once, not because of the clothes, but because I had overheard two girls laughing outside the curtain, saying I looked like I'd been bleached in patches. I hadn't bought anything that day. I had walked out empty-handed, head down, arms wrapped tightly around my torso like a shield. I didn't tell anyone. I just added it to the long list of reasons I needed to be smaller, quieter, less noticeable. The mirrors didn't care about any of that. They just stared back. I sat down slowly on the tufted bench in front of the vanity, the weight of the fabric pooling around my legs. My fingers finally loosened, and the bouquet dropped to the floor with a soft thud. The sound felt final, like a door closing behind me. I reached up and unpinned the veil, letting it fall into my lap like a ghost. I wanted to scream, to rip the dress off and bury it under something heavy. But I didn't. I stayed still. The silence in the room pressed against me, filling every inch of space I had left inside. I felt like I was shrinking again, like the girl I used to be was crawling back to take over. The girl who learned how to fade into backgrounds, who sat in the corners of classrooms and parties, who laughed too loudly to cover her discomfort. The girl who never thought she'd be loved by anyone who saw her fully. But there had been a time, before the wedding, before Michael, when I had started to believe I was enough. I had started to shed the layers, to stop editing my face and hiding my arms. I had begun to take up space, to speak without apologizing, to wear dresses with sleeves that didn't reach my wrists. I had dared to think that maybe the world could meet me where I was, that maybe I didn't have to change to be wanted. And then, in one breath, she had tried to rip all of that away. She didn't just insult me. She aimed at everything I had, built. She knew what it cost me to stand there, bare and unashamed. And she tried to make me feel like I was less, like I was dangerous, like I was wrong for even imagining I could belong to something as pure as their family. The worst part wasn't her words. It was the silence that followed. The silence from the man who had promised to stand by me, the man who knew my history, who had traced the patterns on my skin with his fingertips and called it beautiful, the man who had asked me to spend forever with him, but couldn't spend one moment defending me. In the mirrors, I looked like a bride, but I didn't feel like one. I felt like an exhibit, a display, not because of my skin, but because no one in that room had seen me as whole. Not really. They had seen a body with a story they didn't want to read. I stood again, slowly, the dress rustling like dead leaves. I walked closer to the largest mirror and stared into my own eyes. I needed to find something there, some remnant of the woman I had fought so hard to become. She was quiet, but she was still there. Bruised, but not gone. I didn't cry. I didn't move to wipe away the pain or fix what had been shattered. I just looked, and for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't looking for approval. Not from Michael, not from his mother, not from anyone. I was looking for my next move. It happened a week before the wedding, a late afternoon, the kind where everything looks gold and sleepy. Michael had left for a meeting with the caterers, and I was alone in his apartment, the one we were supposed to share once everything was official. I was organizing the last of my things, trying to make space in his already perfect home. Everything he owned had a place, like it had been designed with architectural precision. Bookshelves lined by color, drawers with smooth dividers, labels on the spice jars. There wasn't much room for chaos, but I'd started to find little corners to claim. That's when I found the drawer. It wasn't hidden or locked, just deeper than the others, tucked in the bottom of his office desk. I had opened it looking for an empty folder, maybe a notebook, something to store the vendor receipts I was carrying around like extra limbs. But what I found instead was a stack of documents, neatly clipped, unmarked. The kind of papers that hum with quiet importance. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The top page was an old letter, printed in a stiff font with a date from nearly 15 years ago. The name on it matched his mother's. I shouldn't have read it, I know that now. But once my eyes caught a single word, I couldn't stop. Genetic. It was a letter from a specialist, detailing the results of an inherited condition, a rare recessive disorder, something that could skip generations but carry consequences if paired with the wrong markers. It wasn't vitiligo. It wasn't anything that showed on the skin. It was internal, neurological, devastating in its advanced forms. The kind of condition you screened for in high-risk pregnancies. The kind of condition that people like his mother would bury with paperwork and money. There were more documents, test results, legal correspondence, a notarized agreement between her and a private clinic, a confidentiality clause, pages and pages of data, medical jargon that painted a picture of a family that had spent years covering something up. I remember sitting there stunned, each sentence unfolding like a secret whispered in the dark. And then I saw the name, Isabel Moore. My name, my full legal name, typed in the corner of a printed family health history form. It wasn't a coincidence. I had never given them access to my medical records, but Michael had once mentioned his mother wanted to know what ran in my family. I'd laughed it off at the time, assuming it was some harmless, overbearing concern. Now it felt like something else entirely. She had run a background check on me. Maybe more. She had searched for anything she could use, anything to justify her belief that I was unfit, that my body, my blood, my future children would be a threat. The irony was unbearable. The very thing she feared, the thing she had screamed at me about in front of everyone, that I would bring damage into their lineage, was already rooted in her own. She was projecting, masking her fear with hatred. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done, not just to me, but to Michael. He had known. He had to have known. That drawer wasn't hidden, wasn't locked. That kind of information doesn't go unnoticed. He had seen the same letters I had, and yet he'd never said a word. I sat on the floor of his office with those papers scattered around me like broken glass. I didn't know how long I stayed there. The sun dipped behind the buildings, and the room grew dim. I could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the hum of his ceiling fan overhead, the soft traffic outside. All of it felt distant, as if I were underwater, watching the world move from somewhere far below. It wasn't just betrayal. It was confirmation. I had spent so long believing I was the variable, the risk, the one who might pass something unwanted, to a child, the one who looked different, who carried difference like a curse. I had internalized that shame so deeply that I stopped asking what others were hiding. I just assumed they were clean, safe, better. But they weren't. And now I had proof. I didn't tell Michael I had found the drawer. I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear his explanations, his excuses, the ways he might try to soften what I had seen. I needed time to hold the truth in my own hands first, to see how it sat against my chest, how it pulsed through my body like something alive. For the rest of that week, I moved like a shadow through the wedding preparations. I smiled in photos, made polite small talk, confirmed timelines and head counts. I let his mother kiss my cheek during the rehearsal dinner, her lipstick leaving a faint red mark over one of the pale spots on my skin. I watched her, and I thought about those papers. I thought about the version of herself she had worked so hard to present, perfect, composed, genetically superior, and the rot she had buried under all that polish. I thought about saying something. At dinner. At the altar. But I kept quiet. Not out of fear, but calculation. I knew there would be a moment when the truth would matter more than vengeance. A moment when I could use what I had found, not to destroy, but to survive. When she stood and screamed at me during the ceremony, I realized that moment had arrived. She had burned the last bridge between us, and in doing so, she had handed me the match to light the rest of her story on fire. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but I knew that I would. And when I did, she would regret ever opening her mouth. The hours after the ceremony bled into each other without edges, as if time had lost the will to move forward. People scattered in quiet waves, unsure whether they were allowed to speak to me, to look me in the eye, to say they were sorry or say nothing at all. Some tried to smile, soft, pitiful smiles that stung more than they soothed. I walked through, the remains of my almost wedding like a ghost among ruins, past overturned champagne flutes, abandoned programs, a string quartet that never finished their second set. Michael's father avoided me altogether. Michael himself hovered, hesitant, as though waiting for a sign from me to approach. But I gave him none. I couldn't. Not yet. I went home that night alone. Not to the apartment we were supposed to share, but to the old studio I hadn't yet let go of. I sat on the edge of the bed in silence, still in my dress, still stained with the memory of her words echoing through the air like a curse spoken over my life. The weight of it clung to me like smoke. I unzipped the gown slowly, peeled it from my body piece by piece, careful not to tear the delicate fabric, even though every part of me wanted to shred it into ribbons. When I finally slipped it off, I stood in the dim light of the room and looked at myself. Just me. No veil, no makeup, no jewelry to hide behind. The patches on my skin were clear in the mirror, bright, unapologetic. The parts of me that had been called unnatural, monstrous, cursed, the very same parts I had learned to see as sacred. She had tried to shame them, tried to weaponize them in front of a crowd. But shame is a weapon that only works if you hand someone the blade. I had stopped doing that a long time ago, but I still needed to decide what to do with what I knew. The folder I'd found sat in my bag like a heartbeat, quiet but undeniable. Its weight had become familiar now, an object I carried not with fear, but with a strange growing power. I took it out again that night, spread the pages across the floor like a mosaic of hidden truths. Her story, her decisions, her desperate attempts to erase risk from her narrative. She had paid off doctors, hidden diagnoses, built a pristine myth around her family line. And now she wanted me gone because I didn't fit the image she fought so hard to project. But I did fit. Not because I was perfect, but because I was real. And the truth was, so was she. There was something poetic about using her own story to break the lie she had built. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to ruin her. I wanted to make her visible. To pull the curtain back and force her to see herself the way I had been forced to see myself my entire life. Without filters, without excuses, without the luxury of silence. The next morning, I made copies of everything. Not to post online or scatter like ashes in front of her social circle, but to keep with me as proof. Proof that the narrative she clung to wasn't real. Proof that the shame she tried to place on my shoulders was hers all along. I didn't need to yell or scream or stoop to her level. All I had to do was be willing to stand in truth longer. Then she could hide from it. But even with that, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I knew what it would cost. If I used the documents, if I forced her hand, Michael would be caught in the fire. I didn't know what part of this he had known, how deep the silence ran, how much he had chosen to ignore. But I knew that once I moved, there would be no going back. So I waited. Waited until I could feel my breath again, until my body stopped vibrating with the memory of her voice. Waited until I could walk into her world not as a bride, not as a victim, but as myself, fully and entirely. The opportunity came faster than I expected. 2 days after the wedding, she invited me to the family estate for a conversation. The message came through Michael, of course, worded in cold politeness, laced with an urgency that betrayed her discomfort. He didn't push. He simply told me she wanted to speak. Alone. I went. Not because I owed her anything, but because I owed it to myself to finish what she started. The estate was as flawless as ever. Marble floors, oil paintings of long-dead relatives who all seemed to share the same piercing eyes. Her eyes. I was led into a sunroom with glass walls and manicured plants that looked too perfect to be real. She sat waiting, a porcelain cup of tea in her hand, the mask already in place. Calm, composed. But her fingers betrayed her. They twitched slightly against the handle, just enough to show the crack beneath the surface. She expected me to beg, to apologize, to explain why I had embarrassed her, to justify the weight of my skin, my presence, my refusal to vanish. Instead, I said nothing. I pulled out the folder and placed it between us on the table. Her face changed, not immediately. She was too practiced for that. But the silence that followed was louder than any insult she had ever hurled. She reached for the pages, slowly, as if each one might burn her fingertips. And as she flipped through them, I watched her shrink, not in size, not physically, but in power. The armor she wore began to crack. Not because I had yelled, not because I had exposed her, but because she knew that I knew. She didn't speak. I didn't need her to. I stood, collected the folder, and left the room without another word. The truth was no longer a weight I carried. It had become something else entirely, a shield, and now I knew how to use it. It was evening when I returned from the estate, the sun already low, painting the horizon in long amber strokes that seemed to mock the chaos beneath their calm. I walked back into my apartment, not feeling victorious or relieved, just emptied out, like everything I had been holding inside. Rage, grief, disbelief had finally been released and left space behind. Not peace, not yet, but a beginning. Something quieter. Something I hadn't felt in months. Stillness. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, my thoughts unraveling slowly as the city murmured below. There were no grand revelations, no cinematic closure, just the faint hum of life resuming itself. I hadn't spoken to Michael since the ceremony. Not one word. He'd called, of course. Texted too. The messages came in waves. First urgent, then desperate, then numb. I read them all but responded to none. I needed him to sit in that silence the way I had been forced to feel what it was like when the person you trusted most watched you be torn apart and did nothing. But the story wasn't over. The next day, the front desk called to let me know I had a visitor. I didn't ask who. I already knew. When I stepped into the lobby, it wasn't Michael. It was his sister, Claire. I hadn't seen her in years, not since a holiday dinner where she had arrived late, left early, and said almost nothing the entire time. Back then, she had seemed like a shadow in the family, quiet, reserved, never speaking out of turn, I'd assumed she was indifferent, maybe even complicit in the silence that surrounded Michael's mother. But now, standing in the light of the lobby, her presence felt different, like something tightly coiled had finally snapped. She didn't ask if she could come up. She just followed me inside. We sat at the kitchen counter, two women bound not by friendship, but by the consequences of another woman's secrets. Her eyes searched mine, not with pity or sympathy, but something closer to understanding. I waited for her to speak, not out of politeness, but because I could sense she had come to say something important, and she did. She told me everything, things I didn't know, things I hadn't guessed, about their childhood, about the hush that surrounded every doctor's visit, every conversation that veered too close to illness or inheritance. She spoke of how their mother had rewritten their family history like a fiction novel, trimming out anything that didn't fit her version of perfection. She said she had tried to speak once, years ago, but had been silenced, cut off financially, emotionally, exiled until she learned to nod and stay quiet. Claire hadn't stayed away because she didn't care. She stayed away because silence was the only protection she had left. She told me she was there, in the back, on the day of the wedding. She hadn't been on the guest list. Michael hadn't even known she'd come. She had stayed out of sight, afraid that her presence would ignite something ugly. But when their mother stood and spat those words at me, Claire said she felt something shift inside her, a breaking point. She had watched her mother try to shatter me with the same cruelty she had once used on her. And for the first time, she couldn't stay hidden. Claire handed me something, a photograph, old and soft at the edges. A picture of the two of them, children, standing in a hospital room beside their father. He looked thin, tired. I hadn't known he'd been sick. No, one had ever said. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, was the name of the condition. The same name from the documents I'd found in Michael's drawer. I held the photo carefully, as if the truth it carried could tear if I gripped too hard. We didn't talk much after that. She stayed a little while longer, then left with a quiet nod, like something unspoken had finally been acknowledged between us. Not forgiveness, not closure, just truth, exchanged and received. Later that night, I invited Michael over, not because I wanted to rebuild something, but because I needed to look him in the eye and ask the question that had been haunting me since the moment his mother stood up at the altar. Why? Why didn't he speak? He stood in my apartment like a man waiting for a sentence, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes rimmed with guilt. He tried to explain how he had frozen, how he hadn't known she would go that far, how he had wanted to protect me but didn't know how. He said he had seen the documents, that he hadn't told me because he thought it didn't matter, that love was enough, that his mother's fear was hers alone, and not something he shared. But he had stood there. He had stood and watched me unravel, watched me be dehumanized, watched me carry the weight of a room full of eyes. And he said nothing. Love is not silent. Love doesn't hesitate. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured us both a glass of wine. I handed him his and held mine with both hands, the stem delicate between my fingers. We clinked them together out of habit. The sound was sharp, high, a fragile note that split the silence, and then in one small, tremulous moment my glass slipped. It hit the tile with a shatter so sudden it seemed to puncture the air. Red wine and glass everywhere splashed across my feet, seeping into the grout. Michael jumped, instinctively reaching to help, but I held up my hand. I knelt, slowly, and began to gather the pieces. Not carefully, not delicately, but with intent. One by one, I placed them into a bowl. The jagged shapes caught the light, glinting like something once beautiful and now broken beyond repair. It wasn't a metaphor. It was just truth. Some things don't get put back together. Some things shouldn't. Michael stood frozen, unsure whether to stay or go. Eventually he left. Quietly, without protest, without asking if I would call him tomorrow. He knew. When the door clicked shut behind him, I sat alone on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of what could have been. And for the first time since the altar, I felt the kind of silence I could live with. The morning after Michael left, I woke up before the sun. The sky outside was still a pale shade of blue-gray, the kind that looks like it's holding its breath. The apartment was quiet, still heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. The broken glass had been cleaned, the wine wiped from the floor, but the sharpness of the moment lingered like a pulse. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring out at the city as it slowly stirred awake, and felt something inside me shift again. Less like a break, more like a release. I wasn't grieving anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was just done. Done. Waiting for permission. Done explaining myself. Done making space for people who never intended to make space for me. For years, I had believed in the idea that acceptance was something to be earned through good behavior, soft smiles, measured words, and silence. I thought if I could just be easy enough, unthreatening enough, beautiful in the right way, quiet in the right way, agreeable in the right way, then I could be loved without condition. But all that effort had been for people who never intended to see me in full, who only loved the version of me they could reshape. I made coffee, got dressed, and packed a small bag. Nothing dramatic, just a few clothes, my camera, a notebook. I needed air. I needed something unfamiliar. The drive north was quiet and long, the road stretching ahead of me like a question waiting to be answered. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that it wasn't back to what I had left behind. I ended up in a coastal town I'd visited once years ago for a photography job. It was small, unassuming, perched along the cliffs like it was bracing itself against the wind. I checked into a motel with salt-streaked windows and a view of the ocean. The room smelled faintly of lemons and old linen, and I loved it immediately. I spent the next few days walking. Just walking. Through markets, along rocky shorelines, past weathered boats and shuttered bookstores. No one knew me here. No one stared too long. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't cover the patches on my skin. The wind touched every part of me and didn't recoil. The sea didn't ask me to explain myself. It just accepted my weight and pulled me into its rhythm. There was a woman at a local diner who served me breakfast each morning. She had one green eye and one brown, and tattoos that crept up her neck like ivy. She never asked my name. She never asked where I was from. She just poured my coffee and nodded like we shared a secret. I liked that. The quietness of it. The absence of performance. On the fourth day, I found a little shop tucked between a surf rental and a plant store. It sold handmade jewelry, ceramics, and old books. At the back, there was a mirror, antique, tall, with a frame chipped and peeling. I looked at myself in it for a long time. The reflection was soft, the glass slightly warped, like it was offering me a kinder version of reality. But I didn't need kindness anymore. I just needed honesty. I stood there and looked. Really looked. Not to see what was wrong. Not to see what needed fixing. But to witness. To bear witness to who I had become in the aftermath. My face, tired but calm. My skin, patchworked and radiant in the sun filtering through the dusty window. My posture, upright, unflinching, and that's when I knew. I didn't need her blessing. I never had. The wedding was never going to be about the vows or the flowers or the seating chart. It had always been about permission, about assimilation, about folding myself into a family that had no intention of unfolding themselves for me. But I wasn't there to become smaller. I wasn't there to disappear into someone else's idea of what I should be. I took out my phone and deleted Michael's number. Not because I hated him. Not even because I didn't love him anymore. But because I finally loved myself more. I sat by the ocean that evening with my feet in the sand, the water lapping at my ankles like an old friend. The wind tugged at my sleeves and I let it. Wrote in my notebook for the first time in weeks. Not about him, not about her, not about the wedding or the glass or the silence. I wrote about breath, about space, about how it feels when you stop needing to be chosen and start choosing yourself. Back home, I knew the stories were still circling. Whispers about what happened, who said what, who walked away. Maybe some of them would say I'd ruined it, that I'd made things harder than they had to be, that I should have stayed quiet, stayed grateful, stayed in line. Let them fill in the blanks with their own discomfort. Let them hold on to their myths. I wasn't theirs to define. I mailed Claire the photo back. No note. Just the image. She'd know what it meant. She'd know I hadn't forgotten. I booked a return ticket, not to go back, but to move forward. A new city. A new rhythm. I didn't know what waited for me there, but I wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. I had faced what tried to erase me, and I didn't disappear, and from now on, every step I took would be mine. No veil, no silence, no blessing needed. It took me longer than I expected to choose where to go next. Not because I was uncertain, but because for the first time in years, I realized I didn't owe my future to anyone else's comfort. I didn't have to be practical. I didn't have to be close to family. I didn't have to explain my choices. I could simply choose. So I did. I moved to Portland. It wasn't a dramatic decision. No symbolic meaning. Just a place I remembered liking when I passed through once during a photography trip. Trees with stories in their bark, streets that felt lived in, skies that never settled into a single mood. It felt like a place where reinvention didn't require permission. I found a studio apartment with creaky floors and windows that faced a street where people played music on Sundays. It was small, but it was mine. I painted one wall deep green, bought cheap furniture secondhand, and spent the first few weeks learning the rhythm of solitude. Not the kind I'd known before. The solitude of exclusion, of waiting to be invited in. But the kind you choose. The kind that nourishes instead of isolates. I started taking photos again. Not for clients or deadlines, but for me. I wandered through the city with my camera slung over my shoulder, collecting moments the way I once tried to collect approval. A couple arguing under an umbrella, a child feeding pigeons with half a muffin, a man with silver hair and gold shoes dancing, alone at a crosswalk. People, as they were. Imperfect, unapologetic, unaware of being observed. In those images, I started to see something I hadn't noticed before. A thread, a pattern. I had spent so much of my life trying to smooth myself into something easy to digest. And now I was drawn to the raw edges in everyone else, the laugh lines, the awkwardness, the small rebellions against perfection. I didn't want to erase those things anymore. I wanted to frame them. I started a small exhibit at a local cafe, just 6 prints, black and white. I called the series Unfinished. The name felt honest. I wasn't offering answers, just glimpses, pieces. The response was quiet but warm. People asked questions, left notes. A woman approached me one afternoon and said she had vitiligo, too. She showed me a spot on her wrist, barely visible, but hers. We didn't say much more. We didn't need to. I registered my photography business under a new name. Not a pseudonym. Not a company title. Just mine. Lena Moore. It might sound small to anyone else, just keeping the name I was born with. But for me, it was everything. Because for so long, I thought I'd have to trade my name, my body, my story, for a seat at someone else's table. I thought I'd have to reshape myself into someone acceptable, someone beautiful in the right ways, someone safe. But now I knew the truth. I didn't need their table. I could build my own. When the business license arrived in the mail, I stared at it for a long time, not because it made things official, but because it was the first thing I'd ever signed with pride in who I was, not shame in who I wasn't. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration. Not loud, not theatrical, just real. The old version of me would have waited for someone to notice, for praise, for validation, for a sign that I was doing something right. But not anymore. I didn't need to be clapped for. I just needed to live fully, to speak honestly, to stop shrinking. Sometimes I still catch myself flinching when I see a certain look in a stranger's eye. That old instinct, the one that expects judgment, that expects rejection. But it passes faster now. I remind myself of everything I walked away from and everything I walked into. I remind myself that I didn't just survive what they did to me. I transformed because of it. Michael emailed me once. A short message. No questions. Just a line. That said he hoped I was well and that he was sorry. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed anything from him. His silence had once been a weight, but now it was just an echo. I let it fade. As for his mother, I never saw her again. I don't know what happened after Claire confronted her. I don't know if she ever faced consequences or if she continued on as if nothing had changed. But I do know this. She will never control another part of my story, not even a sentence. Claire and I keep in touch. Not often, not deeply, but enough. Sometimes she sends me photos from her garden. Sometimes I send her film scans from my walks. There's no pressure. Just a quiet thread between two women who both refused to stay silent. On the anniversary of the almost wedding, I didn't cry. I didn't grieve. I lit a candle. I played the music I'd chosen for the ceremony and danced in my apartment barefoot, alone, laughing at the absurdity of it all, at the beauty, at the loss, at the gain. Because I had gained something, even if no one else could see it. I had gained myself, not the version they wanted, not the version I thought I had to be, but the woman who stayed when everyone else walked away, the woman who stood alone at the altar and still chose to rise, the woman with uneven skin and steady hands, and a name that belonged entirely to her. Lena Moore, not someone's wife, not someone's mistake, not someone's disappointment, just me. And for the first time, that was more than enough. That was victory.